And I'm going to call Ismael Muvingi, who is a lawyer and PhD, Associate Professor, Conflict Resolution and African Studies, and Director, PhD Program, Department of Conflict Resolution Studies, Nova Southeastern University, Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And he will be speaking Beyond Intervention, Reimagining Conflict Resolution as appropriately Indigenous Social Institutions, the Shona Approach.
Thank you. Thank you, and greetings, everybody. Basil, I'm not sure what has happened on the time thing, but Basil, knowing that I'm a recovering lawyer who can talk anybody under the table, gave me strict instructions, 15 to 20 minutes. He said minimum 15, maximum 20. And to stick with that, I'm going to try and stick to my script. And this takes us, I'm going to take us back from the universal global UN to the nitty-gritties of what is conflict resolution, and particularly that chimera of our lives, which is colonization and decolonization, and especially as it relates to knowledge. The conference theme of indigenous resolution practices is timely. There's been much scholarship that has been calling for localization and the adoption of indigenous resolution practices to be mainstreamed in conflict resolution. While that study is very important, it's laudable, it also calls on us to really examine very critically the nature and effect of this mainstreaming. Why? Because the question arises whether indigenous practices are being integrated into mainstream conflict resolution processes, or if they are being assimilated into what has already been established as the process of conflict resolution. To be transparent, I approach the study of indigenous practices from a post-colonial theorizing perspective, and this is just so you know where I'm going. And I'm informed by scholars like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Edward Said, among others. And I explore decolonization of knowledge and practice as furtherance of emancipation. Colonization and decolonization are not yet over. How does emancipatory decolonization relate to resolution practices in the everyday of African social life? And I, in this case, focus on the Shona practices. It's good to theorize and philosophize about decolonization of knowledge, but how does it relate in the everyday, and in what way do we talk decolonization of knowledge? Conflict resolution has developed as a field of integrated scholarship and practice, where there is a trajectory that has been developed. Is this thing? Oh, okay. That's as a trajectory. Conflict has causes, it escalates, and then you get the hating stalemate, and then there's intervention, you have resolution and implementation, and it looks very nice. Or you have the Adam Kell process, where you have power at the base of it and you progress, something like that. I'll come back to unpack this framing of conflict, and I do so in light of those Shona practices to illustrate how problematic this dominant episodic characterization or conceptualization of conflict can be when you look at people in their own social settings. I do so using two Shona practices. There are many others that one could use. I just picked on two as illustrating why the dominant processes and framings that we have may not work very well to speak to indigenous practices, and I had a question about gachacha. It immediately brought to mind the kind of problems we are running into. So I'll talk about Sawira and Mzukuru. Sawira is a friendship relationship, Mzukuru is a blood relationship. Each has an intervener role in conflict, and in both cases, the position precedes conflict. It is permanent, and it encompasses more functions than conflict. The practices are not instituted merely as responses to manifested conflict. They exist before, and they endure beyond any conflict. So the objective is really to use them as illustrations. So who are the Shona? The Shona are a group of people in Zimbabwe. It used to be Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. The British came up with all kinds of names for it. And the Shona traditional political governance forms are gone. They dissolved under the twin interruptions of colonization and the emergence of the modern state. Same story as you find in most places in the world. Many Shona social institutions and spiritual guidance practices dissolved under the onslaught of colonial denigration and delegitimation. Anything Shona is not good. Everything Europe is the right way to do things. That was coupled with, of course, the introduction of new religions. However, some foundational tenets of the Shona persisted and continue to persist today, but they are now increasingly under assault, and there's a crisis as to how do we handle conflict. Do we go the Western way? Do we go the indigenous way? And is there a way where we can find a middle ground? So, Usawira, let me try. These processes, these practices can sound complicated. If it sounds like it needs more explication, let's chat over lunch. So let me start with Sawira. I put those in brown, that's the Shona and the translation of it. Usawira, in Shona, the Sawira is an all-weather friend. The Sawira holds a special place in the social structure, a critical role in both social, economic, and spiritual lives. As one of the people who have studied it, Philemon Chikafa, says, the Sawira role is as multiple as it is complex. Sawira is a family advisor, a reconciler, a voice of conscience, and an unquestioned compadre. The friendship is not taken lightly among the Shona. It is a major commitment that is sealed by a covenant to do all and to give all to your friend. The oath seals that solemn undertaking, and the parties are expected to adhere to the terms until death. It's not revocable. The institution, though, is not entirely bilateral between the friends. It is rooted and enshrined in the social fabric. Its basis is trust, and it is considered immoral for a Sawira to desert a friend, especially when things are going badly. So the saying amongst the Shona goes, Usawira onokunda ukama, literally meaning, and this is from the Ubuntu, which has been referenced before, this special friendship bond is greater than blood relationship. So what is this to do with conflict resolution? When we talk about mediators, facilitators, etc., the Sawira doesn't quite fit into any of these. And I'll come back to a summary of why. The Sawira is equipped to solve problems, not through training. They don't go to any training school, but they do so through commitment, dedication, trust, and familiarity and immersion in the values and interests of the friend. The institution is vested with privilege and obligation to speak without reproach, to give advice, to critique, and to give backing to the friend without limit. A Sawira or a Mzukuru, which is the other institution I will try and explicate next, are instituted to get into even the most intimate of conflicts in the family, including marital. So what about the Mzukuru? Mzukuru is even more complex, and it takes several forms. In its simplest form is the grandchild. Your grandchild is your Mzukuru. However, there's another mzukuru, the son of your sister, the daughter of your sister, if you're a man, is a mzukuru. Similarly, the child of your brother, if you're a woman, is a mzukuru. That type of mzukuru has a different role than the grandchild. And that role is also permanent. It's not by choice. And it relates to conflict and conflict resolution. It attaches by virtue of blood relationship. It gets more complicated because it's not just the sister's child. It can be extended through kinship. Generally, a mzukuru enjoys a privileged position, being permitted to tease and banter the sekuru, to use property without reproach, but more important, to indulge in forms of behavior not granted to any other class of relative. It is characterized by deep respect on both sides, but for the mzukuru, who is the sister's child or the brother's child, there comes another role that the mzukuru plays. That mzukuru is an intervener, a mediator, a facilitator, a conflict resolver for the uncle or aunt without restraint. And it's deliberately set up in that way. In fact, so ingrained is this role that if ever the aunt or uncle get into trouble, the mzukuru is also blamed. And the question is asked, where were you when the uncle and the aunt were getting into this trouble? So to compare the two, they overlap to quite a degree, and sometimes they work together. The sawira, though, is always voluntary. The mzukuru inheres by virtue of relationship. Neither, however, is open to questioning. Neither can be withdrawn. What these roles illustrate, to move now to why conflict resolution and where does decolonization come into this? What these roles illustrate or reveal is the pluralistic and complex social identities in the Shona, which conflict with social practices for addressing conflict and its resolution. And it problematizes the framing which we now have of conflict, where we look for an intervener because conflict has happened. It doesn't happen like that in the Shona. It also problematizes another aspect of conflict resolution, where we place the parties to a conflict, the actor in a conflict, as at the center of that conflict, as a rational, autonomous actor. Because of Ubuntu, you are never autonomous in Shona society. Once the problem arises, whether you like it or not, I, as a mzukuru, am involved. It's automatic. So, to try and summarize a few of the pointers to how what has come to be the framing of conflict becomes problematic for societies like the Shona, is looking at those two roles and designating the mzukuru, the sawira, as an intervener. A number of things. One, the intervener here is not an intervener by virtue of the occurrence of a conflict. They are there before, during, and after. They persist beyond the conflict. Secondly, parties in the conflict may not have much choices to who is going to be the intervener. Maybe a given if it's a mzukuru, and the sawira has the right to come in if they feel there is a problem. We talk about escalation on that bell curve. Well, it doesn't quite happen like that because sometimes the surfacing of the conflict, the escalation is coming from the sawira who says, I think there's a problem here. And they go in and they perturb it so that it surfaces and can be addressed. Maybe the society which goes to the sawira and says, you know, your friend is causing us problems. Do something. So the conflict gets escalated to the point where there is intervention. Probably most significant and problematic for conflict resolution is that these interveners are not impartial or independent. They come in to resolve the conflict not on the basis of equivalence. It's the norms and values of the community which they will be trying to follow and bringing harmony. So these processes call for us to study indigenous conflict resolution processes in their own right, not necessarily as variations on the Western model of conflict resolution. And why look at it through the lens of decolonization? What we're realizing more and more is that the political liberation, the territorial liberation, wasn't the end. Even more problematic is the decolonization as an epistemological issue, the creation of knowledge, the propagation of knowledge, and what practices we utilize in other societies. We have heard lots of scholars saying, let's bring in the local and the indigenous, and it's laudable, it's great. But there's a problem. They study the indigenous, but there's no attempt to study and problematize the dominant into which the indigenous is imported. It's assumed that is the norm, and we bring in the indigenous as an add-on. So in our field, we have started questioning that, because at times, through these simple illustrations, those indigenous systems just don't fit in. So what it calls for is what Ngugi has called decolonization of the mind. We need to decolonize the knowledge structure here, the dominant knowledge structure, to sensitize it to the other ways of knowing, so that what we end up with is not the assimilation of the indigenous into the bell curve or the Adam Kell power structure, but to see how do indigenous processes work, how does the Adam Kell triangle or squares, how do they operate, and then find a middle ground, rather than the indigenous processes, where do we fit them in these puzzles? And they fit in, and they are designated as mediation or facilitation, and we go, what the heck are you talking about? That doesn't work in my society. So decolonization is not going to be easy. It has started, but it is not going to be easy, because as we know, there's a political economy that undergoes the production and maintenance of knowledge. Indeed, there's money, there's research money, that enables me to go to Africa and research Africa. Those Africans, how many of them do you find propagating African ways of knowing in a Western university? So we're not on par. That needs addressing. What, excuse me, also the research and the incorporation of indigenous practices and cultures into conflict resolution, and I speak specifically about conflict resolution. It happens in other arenas of knowledge as well. Often is claimed as we are correcting things because now we are all working together to create a universal basis of knowledge. But what you will find in many cases, and I was confronted with this by people from my own culture of origin when I went there to do research, is that what they pointed out is, look, the people come here and do research, and they rely on trusted informants who are local, that some of them don't even speak the language. The research, though, is already designed. It's initiated, organized, and carried out by an outsider, not by an indigenous person. And they said, to put it crudely, and these were not my words, the research we're finding is extractive. We get people coming, getting knowledge, interviewing Africans, producing data, surveying them, and then coming out with dissertations, with theories that follow the precepts that are already laid out that are acceptable, that will be accepted in journals, that are peer-reviewed. Where? In that other context. And if it doesn't fit, maybe you'll produce it in a little journal somewhere in Southern Africa and it ends there. So, as we look into indigenous practices, what this is calling for, and I'm not the only person doing this, it's already quite a discussion in the field of conflict resolution. What it is calling for us to do is, as we look into indigenous practices, we need to think through whether Africa is an object of study by Africanists, or is Africa a place in which knowledge and practices are produced and applied? What is the nature of indigenous practices as conceptualized in their own right? And is there a common ground where we can reimagine conflict resolution and other processes, interventions, etc., not merely as add-ons, but as other ways of knowing and doing, which will enhance our abilities to deal with conflict and its resolution. So where to from here? The objective is not to fragment Africa and secede and say we go our own way, but rather the objective is, can we open up conflict resolution practice to the rest of humanity, to share, in fact, the universe? Ngugi propositioned that to decolonize knowledge requires that we coldly and consciously look at what imperialism has been doing to us and to view ourselves in the universe as who we are. We don't need to descend the other in order to send ourselves, but we definitely need to be present in the public sphere. Like quoted again another scholar from critical theory, Habermas, who has said the public square is never empty, it's never vacant. And if you are absent, others will speak for you. And so there's need for that speaking, for those knowledge structures to also be brought to the fore. Just as and I think Professor Ozwike, who spoke first, alluded to this. There isn't an attempt, I'm not saying we should go find an African tradition that is fixed in time where we can find this as a tradition. And you will have noticed I avoid the term traditional, and it's for a reason. African traditions are not frozen. We don't want to freeze culture and create museums of living communities. They're very dynamic, and they've adapted. I get now emails from my sekurus and aunts, and they want to get onto Skype or WhatsApp to discuss their problems. And I'm here in Fort Lauderdale, and they are at home, and the aunt may be in Canada. Technology has facilitated the process of decolonization. Far from globalization becoming a homogenizing process, it has awakened the awareness of difference and facilitated our realization of how different we are and what other methods we have which we may have been sidelining. Oops. I'm not sure where that is coming from, but it's definite. I'm not sure that when I said technology, I didn't mean for technology to immediately come in and demonstrate its presence. So can we reimagine conflict resolution? Absolutely. We learn so much when we truly dialogue in such a way that each subject understands the other across differences and with this recognition of similarities without necessarily identifying as each other. Decolonization will require transforming the structures that we now have in place and to seek collaboration, which is on an equal footing. That has to start by recognition of each of the structures rather than incorporation of one into the other. This is not as revolutionary as it may sound, believe me. I was at a conference just this last week on Saturday, and I was talking to a colleague from the United States Institute of Peace, and he surprised me. he came up with, we have been chasing the wrong thing in conflict resolution because we've been thinking conflict resolution using development as our basis, the development trajectory. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, we have this concept that conflict develops in a linear progression. We have it, underlying causes, it surfaces, it escalates. But where have you ever found that? Being out in the field, and he was just coming from Myanmar, because it depends which name you want to use, and he says, well, what we really have found in the field is that conflict is multi-layered, multifaceted, and it's very gray. This, it's either or, is very problematic. I immediately thought about my own tradition, where the norm for us is things are gray. You're a genius or a god if you can find black and white, right or wrong, in anything. And so there's already within even the Western knowledge houses a recognition that the way in which we have constructed conflict and its resolution is exclusionary of other ways of knowing, of other practices, and we need to step back and think, as we think indigenous practices are important, to think of them not in terms of bringing them in, but to think of, let's open up the universe of knowledge and practice. I want to end with a quote from Achille Mbembe, and for some people that's a red flag. He is post-colonial, almost revolutionary. And Achille Mbembe says, we need to create universal knowledge which embraces horizontal strategy of openness to dialogue among different epistemic traditions. And this is what I'm urging for the conflict resolution field, to rethink itself not as an established field with established processes and intervention methods, but rather to open also to other alternative ways in which people make meaning, in which people address conflict. And in the Shona, it's institutionalized. It doesn't come when conflict comes. It's integrated in the everyday. And with that, I leave us to maybe discuss, what does it mean for the field? Does this mean we now have chaos and dissolution of the field? Or do we now have a richer discussion? And I hope for the latter. Thank you very much.